Hey folks, I'm excited to be here at the Embedded Online Conference. My name is Dylan Swartz, and today we're going to talk about implementing DevOps in IoT and how we can enhance collaboration and streamline firmware delivery. Just a quick overview of what we'll cover today. I'll talk about my personal journey in DevOps, why I'm passionate about it, go through the benefits of incorporating DevOps in the context of embedded development. I'll do a demo using GitHub Actions to do CI/CD, actually deploy an OTA update to a physical device. And expanding on that, I'll just talk through some steps you can take to do provisioning at scale. And finally, I'll share a story about a company I worked with in the past who really got a lot of efficiency gains out of using a DevOps approach to dealing with their devices. Okay, a bit about me. I'm a software engineer by trade turned product manager. I've been doing product for the last 5 years or so. I currently work for a company called Goliath, where we offer what we call an instant cloud for embedded developers. Our aim is to make it as easy as possible for you to get your sensor data up to the internet, pull down OTA updates, handle logging, things like that, so you can focus on your hardware and your firmware while we take care of all the cloud infrastructure bits. All right, so some background. Why am I even talking about this? So about 10 years ago now, when DevOps was the hot new buzzword and companies were trying to scramble to do DevOps, I was working as a software engineer at a company called Cengage Learning. I was part of a core infrastructure team there responsible for making all the other teams in the company go faster. We were sort of tasked with leading the charge on helping the company move from a physical data center in Mason, Ohio, to the cloud, and in this case, AWS. With that, we also had the goal of giving developers at the company autonomy and the freedom to set up their own infrastructure and deployments. This got us into using AWS CloudFormation, Puppet, and Chef, and kind of building our own tooling around that. But the key to our success wasn't just about buying or building tools. It was more about organizational and team structure. To achieve this, we embedded or decentralized the operations team, embedded what were called, at the time, system administrators, sysadmins, who are now called DevOps engineers, onto our team, onto many teams. This encouraged knowledge sharing, collaboration among folks who were typically in silos, and the result was awesome. I still remember it to be one of the best teams, the most fun I'd ever had on a team in my career. I learned so much, and we managed to reduce the release time from 2 weeks of code freezes, change requests, ops tickets, to just a few minutes. And this experience taught me the value of DevOps in the context of the cloud. And as I've gotten into IoT and embedded building hardware over the last several years, I believe we can apply these same concepts and methodologies to the embedded world and get the same level of efficiencies. A fleet of devices is really just a data center with intermittent connectivity and power, right? So why is it crucial to incorporate DevOps in the embedded development space in the first place? I just said that. A fleet of devices is like a data center, but even more complicated. And there's a few reasons. The first is just getting that improved collaboration. DevOps emphasizes developers and operations folks working together. And in this case, instead of maintaining servers, the operations folks are physically kitting and packaging and shipping devices out to the customer. They're that last touch point before a device hits a customer. collaborating leads to better understanding and faster solving of operational problems, customer pain points, things like that. This results in a streamlined process, which ultimately gets you faster time to market. The automation that comes from it, you can deploy new features and improvements more quickly, giving your product and your company a competitive edge over competition who is not doing this. And probably the most common, first thing folks think of is quality, enhanced reliability. Concepts like automated testing, continuous integration reduce the likelihood of errors, ensuring that issues are caught early in the development cycle before they actually get out into the field and on devices in the hands of customers. And then scalability. Just like a good DevOps practice in the cloud can help you horizontally scale and handle load, good DevOps practice in the embedded world can help you manage growth and ensure your infrastructure and processes can handle increasing demands from customer orders, letting you provision and ship out more and more devices quickly. Okay, so let's see how we can put some of these concepts into practice. Of course, I can't show you in a 20-minute talk how to reorganize your team and get folks talking to each other more. But I can show you a cool continuous integration, continuous delivery demo using GitHub Actions. I have an ESP32 here. It's in the Feather form factor, a Feather board with some Grove sensors plugged in for air quality monitoring. I'm not going to focus so much on that, more so just the setup for automation. It's built using the ESP IDF with an Arduino component to help me get those sensors working. And I also use the Goliath SDK for OTA updates, which I won't focus on as much, more so, as I mentioned, the automation piece. All right, I'll walk through a GitHub Actions workflow. This is GitHub Actions here, and really it's got two main components that'll help us effectively build our firmware and deploy it. The build job actually isn't really anything custom. It uses Espresso's pre-built GitHub action for ESP IDF to build our code. I'll dig into this more in a minute, but you can find it in the GitHub Actions Marketplace if you just search Espresso for ESP IDF. The build is actually triggered whenever a new tag is pushed to the repo and on pull requests to the repo. Then there's the deploy job, as you can see, which installs Goliath's CLI tool, authenticates with Goliath, uploads the firmware artifact into effectively a registry, and releases that artifact to a set of devices via OTA. Let's click into the workflow file and see what that looks like. This is kind of long, so I'll zoom in here into the build job specifically. It's got a couple of different steps. The first one on line 15 just checks out the code. This step actually pulls down the code from the Git repo. The next step, ESP IDF build, we actually use the ESP IDF CI action from Espresso. So this is not anything we built, as I mentioned. The only thing we really configured here is the ESP IDF version 4.4.4, and the target board, which is a ESP32, and the path to where our code lives, and that's just the root directory of the code that's being checked out in the repo. We also pass in some environment variables, some pre-shared keys to do authentication with Goliath. I'll touch on that later. And then finally, at the end, we store the built firmware binary as an artifact inside of the GitHub Actions runner, so we can pass it to our next job, which is the deploy job. The deploy job is a little bit wider. Hopefully you can see that. The only real difference in sort of the logic here is there's an if conditional at the top that effectively checks to see how this was triggered. Was it triggered by a pull request or by a tag being pushed? we don't want our deploy job to run every time there's a pull request, but we do want our build job to run because we want to run in unit tests, ensure the build completes. We could get into doing some hardware in the loop testing, like that kind of thing on every pull request, so that we can try to catch issues earlier in the process. But we don't want to deploy OTA updates out to devices every single time. That would be chaotic. So getting into the first step here, again, it on line 40 there, 41, it checks out the code. Right after that is installing the Goliath CLI. Goliath has a number of different ways to interact with the platform, CLI tool, APIs, as well as device-side clients and web console. If you're familiar with Ubuntu or any Debian-based Linux distros, I'm sure you've used the apt package manager before. So this is just apt install the Goliath CLI. We log into Goliath on the next step using our API key and set a project ID. The project ID you can think of kind of like the product you're building in the context of Goliath. You can have multiple projects. And then we download the artifact that we've uploaded, that firmware binary from our previous step. We download that, and I use this action if you're looking at line 56, get the latest release version number to get the version number of the tag that's being pushed, and we'll use that for releasing our artifacts. So the last two steps there is talking to Goliath. Goliath CTL DFU artifacts, we're actually then able to upload the binary and store it in Goliath effectively in an artifact registry. That's not deployed out to any devices yet, but it's there for future archival as you get into immutable infrastructure, immutable builds. We don't want folks building on their own local machines and just uploading them to a Google Drive somewhere for slashing in a factory. The last piece is actually creating a release. So that last line there, Goliath CTL DFU release, that command works by taking in a particular component of your firmware, which I only have a single main application, and a version number. You can then give it a set of tags. Tags are a way to segment devices in Goliath for targeting OTA updates. So you could have dev, staging, prod, or some folks will group these by different customers. There's a couple of different ways to do this. I'm using tags here, which allows me to target the collection of devices that are tagged as dev. And the ESP32 on my device is tagged as dev. We'll see that in a minute. But the way to kick this process off is to push a new tag to the Git repo. So creating version 1.1.4, pushing that up to the repo actually would kick off that entire build process and deploy process. So let's take a look at how that shows up in Goliath. When you first log in, you're presented effectively with a list of your devices. And if you go down to the firmware section, there's artifacts and releases. On the artifacts stage, you see a list of all the different artifacts or firmware binaries that have been uploaded. And you can see version 1.1.4 is from my most recent CI build there. Under releases, I also have a number of different releases here that may or may not be rolled out to devices. The last one you can see, 1.1.4, is going to devices tagged as dev. If I go back to my device list, I have one device tagged as dev, and that's the ESP32 sitting on my desk. You can see a bunch of good information and details about that device, logs, things like that. And on the right side, under the firmware section, what version it's on, 1.1.3. And if I flip over to the firmware tab, I can see that there's an update pending. It's actually downloading version 1.1.4, just as we expected. Once it downloads, it'll update, install the new version, come back online, and report to Goliath like, hey, I am now up to date. That's a whirlwind tour of just how we are doing OTA updates using Goliath here. Let's talk about how we can take that to the next level. Now that we have our CI/CD pipeline set up, we know that security is crucial for IoT, and certificate-based authentication is generally the way to go when provisioning devices at scale. Goliath actually provides a cert-based authentication solution as well that simplifies the provisioning process and ensures devices have unique security identities, things like that. I'll give you just a quick overview here. You can check out our docs and blog posts to get into all the nitty-gritty, juicy details. But in a nutshell, Goliath's certificate-based authentication has several advantages over the pre-shared keys you may have seen in my demo earlier, those environment variables I kind of glossed over. It simplifies the registration of a large number of new devices. So if you're deploying a large fleet, this is especially helpful in a production environment. Also ensures that compromised devices don't expose their keys. This helps kind of keep things safe, keeps things safe. And the process for implementing it on Goliath can be done really in 3 steps. That's generating your self-signed root certificate, uploading that public root certificate, the public key to Goliath, and then generating device certificates. I don't have enough time to go all the way into every single piece of this here, but that's it in a nutshell. For a deeper dive into the cert-based authentication and a step-by-step guide on implementing it, I highly recommend this blog post at the bottom. Take a screenshot now, go to that URL. My coworker Mike, who wrote it, is here giving a talk at the Embedded Online Conference too, so check his out too. But this post will walk you through the entire process from generating the certs to getting them on Goliath. And if you're doing any sort of deployments where it takes a lot of time to provision and ship devices, if that's the bottleneck, I'd really encourage you to take a look at this approach. I have some first-hand experience there. I've recently worked with a company in the clinical trial space that was building devices to capture information for clinical drug trials. And this is a mix of touchscreen devices capturing like survey questions, qualitative information from participants in studies, and other embedded devices like heart rate monitors, and they had this thing called a spirometer that measured your breathing. So in the case of a COVID-19 study, for example, they needed to measure the lung capacity, and this device was a Bluetooth-enabled send data up to the cloud of your lung capacity. When I started working with them, they were facing major challenges of just hitting timelines for delivery. They had just a bit about clinical trials. They had the drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, as sponsors of these studies, funding these studies, and they had pretty hard deadlines that they were set on reaching a certain number of patients being enrolled in the study. So the clinical trial company here really had to get those devices out the door and hit those deadlines, but they were struggling just due to how long it took to manually provision and configure devices before shipping them out. And the operations team in a silo was trying to solve this by adding more people. But they implemented some DevOps-inspired methodologies, including not just CI/CD and automated provisioning, but taking it all the way to an integration with their inventory system. Their developers worked with their operations team to identify and develop a process that automatically customized the configurations on devices based on which customer it was going to, which customer is being shipped to. And this is really important because every single drug study had slightly different parameters, slightly different configurations that needed to be set up. And it was just such an arduous process to do this manually. And by the dev team working with the operations team and building this solution, which integrated their IoT management platform with their inventory system, it helped them go from shipping about 300 devices a month to over 3,000 devices per month, which can show that the collaboration piece of implementing DevOps is just as important as the tooling, if not more. All right, so we are running out of time here, so I want to just thank you all for listening. We've talked through all kinds of philosophical stuff, some technical demos of continuous integration, continuous deployment, the idea of secure provisioning with certificate-based authentication. It was a lot. I appreciate you listening. Hopefully you got some ideas on how to streamline your development process, your firmware delivery. I just want to use this last minute or so to plug Goliath, who has been amazing, letting me come to the conference, give this talk instead of doing my regular work. I encourage you to just check out Goliath if you're building any kind of connected device. Not only does it provide a secure, scalable platform for managing devices, doing OT updates like I showed here, but we have a ton of other features to address all kinds of needs and use cases in IoT. Things from remote logging, settings management, state data, time series data. It's an ideal choice for a lot of companies who just want to focus on their hardware and their firmware. We have a dev tier. You can start with up to 50 devices for free. This lets you experiment, see the benefits for yourself. You don't have to talk to a salesperson. To get started, just go to Goliath.io and sign up. And thanks for joining me today. Hope you found this presentation interesting, insightful, and have fun.